Welcome to Resiliency Within. This is Elaine Miller-Karas, and I am so happy to have with me my dear friend and colleague, Lesley Carroll, who's the prisoner ombudsman of Northern Ireland. I'll tell you a little bit more about her and let you know a little bit about what our show is going to be about today. It has been a hard few months with the violence that we've been experiencing in society. And because I just got back from Northern Ireland, and of course, they had the conflict there, the troubles, which I'll have Lesley talk a little bit about. But I think their society has been working really hard to try to mitigate the impact of the aftermath of the extreme violence that they experienced in their society. And so I call this today the lessons from Northern Ireland, because I find that Lesley is a very wise soul, and she's going to share with us today some of her insights. But goodness gracious, from the streets and towns across the world, from cities like Chicago to the genocide of Srebrenica, Bosnia, what lessons can we learn from the peacemaking in Belfast? Lesley has been involved in peacemaking and healing some of the historical traumas, not only of the past, but also what happens in the present moment. So, as I said, she's a wise sage, and she's going to share some of her perspectives of what she's learned about living in Belfast. But also, I think she's encountered some very interesting human beings who are working on the side of humanity to bring us together and not apart. So here she is as the prisoner ombudsman of Northern Ireland. It's a job which she says she cherishes as an opportunity to bring hope to those who experience a loss of voice and respect. She investigates complaints from prisoners and deaths in custody, including post-release deaths. Lesley Carroll has always had a strong vocation to help bring healing and peace to her community. This led her into the ministry of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, and she was ordained in 1988 when she was just a wee lad. Look at that. I can even talk like I'm from Northern Ireland, a wee lad. She ministered in 3 congregations in deeply divided communities in the north side of Belfast for nearly 30 years. She truly is a natural leader and worked with people from across the community to increase understanding, end conflict, and seek reconciliation. She was a member of the government-appointed consultative group in dealing with Northern Ireland's troubled past, which reported in 2009. And she was a member of the Victims and Survivors Forum 2012 to 2014, and the Deputy Chief Commissioner of the Equality Commission of Northern Ireland from 2016 to 2019. So you can see she has a rich past that brings us to her amazing wisdom that she has for us today to share some of her perspectives. So Lesley, welcome. And what is on your mind today, my friend?
Thank you, Elaine. It's nice to see you and to have a conversation this evening. I suppose what really was on my mind when you invited me to take part in your show this evening was this whole issue of violence, because today is actually the anniversary of the genocide in Srebrenica, Bosnia, where 8,000, just over 8,000 men and boys, mostly Muslims, were killed. And I saw a film about that last week. So we have very close links between Belfast and Srebrenica. And that just meant that violence was on my mind, and the helplessness that we often feel in the face of overwhelming violence in particular. And as you say, it's been a tough few months. Texas, for one, but in so many other
Well, and
ways, so much violence. Yeah, Ukraine,
Ukraine.
absolutely.
And I
Yeah.
think, one of the things that you and I were talking about before the show started was there's things that we know about that have been more in the press, and there's things that we don't know about.
Yeah.
And when we talked about the genocide in Srebrenica, I was saying, gosh, in 1995, when that happened, I was raising small kids. I wasn't paying that much attention. I knew that it happened, but for some reason now, as I pay attention to 8,000 boys and men, because the city was supposed to be, it was acknowledged, right, by the United Nations as a safe city. And so
Yes.
for the reason that probably is about religion, that was overlooked, and all those men and boys were killed. And so knowing that what happened in Belfast was, I mean, I know that there's other undercurrents of, besides being Catholic and Protestant, that have
Yeah.
led
Yeah.
into the troubles. And Lesley and I were again, talking before we started, and before I knew about the conflict that happened in Northern Ireland, but I didn't know what the Troubles meant. So maybe that would be good too when we talk about some of the things you want to talk about. What are the Troubles? What were the Troubles? And if you can just say a little bit about that, so our listeners know what that means.
Okay, so the island of Ireland is currently divided into north and south, 6 counties in the northeast, which is called Northern Ireland, and then 26 counties, which is the country of Ireland, which is separate from Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So we are a part of the British piece, and then across the border, the Irish piece. So that settlement around the border, which happened just over 100 years ago, hasn't been pleasant for everybody, shall we say. So there have been ongoing outbursts of violence related to that. So when we talk about the Troubles or the conflict, we're generally talking about 40 years of violence, which began somewhere around 1968, 69, and which were then, well, I was going to say settled, but that wouldn't be entirely true. But we did reach a peace agreement in 1998, which was known as the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. It was signed on Good Friday.
And
So
so
40 years of violence, sorry. And Elaine was laughing with me earlier and saying she thought that the Troubles was just my way of talking about it. Actually, it's very political how you describe those
yes,
40 years of violence. So we kind of have come to a public settlement, and we talk about the conflict in public, but some people do talk about the Troubles because they feel to raise what happened to the status of conflict is to give recognition to terrorism, and they don't like that. So it can be quite politicized. So by and large, the Protestant community, which is unionist and is very happy to stay in the union with Great Britain, we would by and large talk about the Troubles, or have talked about the Troubles, whereas in the Catholic Nationalist Republican community, which would like all of the counties of Ireland to be one country of Ireland, they would often talk about the conflict. So that's the kind of broad strokes of it.
well, and I was instructed about that when I came to do some trainings. And so I would say, and so when during the conflict Troubles, I would just kind of put that slash and say it both. So because I knew I had Catholics and Protestants in the same training. And I imagine that's for me coming as an outsider into Belfast, but you live there, that I really have seen that there is a politics of semantics and how important that is.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, and the other thing that strikes me about how you just described 100 years ago was way before any of us were alive, and most of people in Northern Ireland were not alive 100 years ago, and yet the stamp of what happened 100 years ago is very much present in what's happening in present day. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Memory is a really interesting thing to think about. So memory is ever present, if you like. So some memory has so much power to it, and the historical memory, the political historical memory in this part of the world is very strong. So again, if you were to talk to the unionist loyalist community, which is largely Protestant, we would be likely to be thinking of history and memory in terms of those 100 years. If you were to talk to the Nationalist Republican community, which is by and large Catholic, they would be thinking in terms of hundreds of years.
Yes.
Because they feel that their land has been under the heel of the British Empire for hundreds of years, not just for this 100 years. So it's quite interesting there how memory works. So in terms of making peace, actually, it's really important that we acknowledge the way that memory works differently for both sides of the conflict, and then to try to work our way inside the head of the other person, the so-called enemy, to understand how memory is influencing them. So it's very important that I'm from the Protestant community. It's very important that I try to understand the length, the longitudinal memory that the Catholic community is influenced by, so that I can understand why they think, behave, react, respond the way that they do. And that is a real stretching of the mind. And in some ways then for the other community to listen to me with my very short memory, actually, as the Protestant community, thinking in terms of this wonderful 100 years of this Northern Irish state, um, for someone from the Nationalist Catholic community to shrink their memory into that short 100 years and understand why the Protestant Unionist community thinks differently. This is a significant challenge, how we handle memory and how we understand the function of memory for different communities.
Well, and I think as you're speaking, I'm thinking about things that have happened all over the world, whether it be in the genocide that we mentioned earlier, or whether it's about how we segregate people in terms of race or religion, that those same issues that you're talking about that are important to be mindful of exist in so many places. I can say in the United States as well as Northern Ireland and other parts of the world. So, knowing, one of the things that's been humbling about coming to Northern Ireland for myself as an American, first of all, is how much you all know about American politics, which is always like, to me, I think you know more about American politics than most people I meet in America. But I think the other part that's been very telling to me is how many people have come from around the world to Northern Ireland in peacekeeping efforts. And I'm wondering,
Absolutely.
is that we're talking about violence, but we're really also, you and I are both dedicated to peace and how we provide peace within ourselves and the world. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit with us about what are the lessons learned about being in this kind of center of the conflict that happened in Northern Ireland and also as a Presbyterian minister, trying to understand that perspective of hundreds of years versus 100 years.
Yeah, and so what came to my mind there when I was talking was Vamek Volkan, who wrote a book called Bloodlines from Ethnic Pride to Ethnic Terrorism. I think Vamek is a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and lives in the States as far as I know. But anyway, in his book, he writes about chosen glories and chosen traumas. And in conflict, he describes how different sections of a community will choose totemic memories, totemic incidents in history, if you like. Some of them glories in the sense that these were victories for us and our community. These are the good times for us and our community. So, for example, here in Northern Ireland tonight, there will be bonfires lit all over this small piece of land, because tomorrow is the big celebration for the Protestant community on what we call the 12th of July celebration. So it's a bit like your 4th of July independence. It's our 12th of July, remembering how we came to be in this part of Ireland, if so to speak. So this is a chosen glory night for the Protestant Unionist community. It can be quite a traumatic night for the Nationalist Republican community, and there will be reasons for that. For example, posters of MLA. Sorry, you don't know what an MLA is. A member of our local assembly, our legislature. You could find posters of people who are from the Nationalist Republican community on the bonfire, or you could see the Irish flag flying on a bonfire. So it can be quite traumatic. So
Oh my.
to
So, I mean, actually, they will
yep,
burn the
yeah,
person's effigy
yeah,
and they will burn
the flag.
the flag of the Irish Republic.
They will. Yes,
Whoa.
absolutely. Yes. Now, not on every bonfire, but on some bonfires. So you can see how what is a glory for one community is a trauma for another part of the community. The other interesting thing, you talked there about the international dimensions as well, Elaine, and what's interesting, even talking about this evening, you will find Palestinian flags potentially on the bonfires as well. And so one of the ways we mark territory in Northern Ireland is by using flags. So we use our own flags, so that if you were to drive through some communities, which are single identity communities, you will find a Union Jack, which is the flag of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, or you will find an Ulster flag, or you will find the flag of Israel. Whereas if you drive through a Republican nationalist community, you will find the Irish flag, you'll find the Palestinian flag.
Oh, so they've made
they,
sides
yeah,
regarding Israel and
yeah,
Palestine,
yeah,
with one being towards Palestine and the other one being towards
yeah,
Israel. So it's a further way of divisiveness.
exactly. And connecting to the wider world around us. So to acknowledge that there is division at an international level, and that actually communities in division connect to each other in a way that further divides them. So I think that's perhaps an important thing to acknowledge, that attempting to make peace in one part of the world can influence peace in another part of the world, or the ability of people to
Or
build
the
peace.
opposite, right?
Or the opposite, precisely.
So, I mean, and knowing you and the kind of person that you are, you have been drawn to trying to bring peace into the world. So
Yeah,
I'm just, what are some of the things that you have
yeah,
done and
yeah.
been involved with personally that you think has made a difference in your community, Lesley, besides being a person? I mean, I guess what I've noticed about you is you're willing to do what I call that deep dive of listen, to someone else's perspectives that may be different than your own. I just think that's so interesting when some people can't do that, that they're just so embedded and this is the only way that it is and don't say anything else. So just speak to us a little bit about that.
Okay. So I don't find this particularly easy to talk about.
I know,
I
Lesley.
don't, I don't, I don't think that there's anything particularly special here, right? But I do think what was important for me was that, and it was a matter of faith for me. So my faith, um, really demanded of me that I listen to my enemies, or take some account of my enemies. Okay, so uh, pray for those who persecute you. That's what we read in the Bible. Love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you. Okay, so that was an overriding biblical notion that was in my mind. Now, I grew up in County Tyrone, which is a small country area, way outside of Belfast. Really very divided. The town where I went to school was the most bombed town in Northern Ireland when I was a teenager. So it would have been quite normal for us. And again, when you think in terms of genocide in Srebrenica or Rwanda, like these are very different experiences. The much sharper, shorter, high impact experience of genocide, but that in Northern Ireland, it was the low grade, ongoing violence that just dripped at us for 40 years and was just overwhelming by the length of time of it. So it would have been quite normal for me to want to go into town after school to get the bus back home, and we couldn't because the town was closed, or on occasions to meet people walking down the street with blood and dust on them because there'd been a bomb. Our school day could have been interrupted fairly regularly with the threat of a bomb in our school. So we learned very early in life how to do a fire drill, and how, when they say at a fire drill, move quickly and quietly, girls. Um, we learned to just stand up immediately. We didn't never picked anything up, never spoke. Most kids shouldn't have to learn that.
Well, and
Uh,
when you talk about that, when you're talking about when it's a drill, when there isn't something happening, but you had
yes.
things that were life threatening. And when you talk about you being a teenager during a time when there's so much generativity and growth, and here you never knew whether or not there'd be a bombing where someone would be killed or hurt or maimed. And so, what was that like for you as a kid? I mean, were you always worried about, am I going to be okay? Am I going to be safe?
Um, no, Strangely, no. And I think that you're quite right that there is a difference between a presumption of this being a drill and the presumption this might not be a drill. So you
Yes.
couldn't even make the presumption that it wasn't a drill, because it might have been a drill. It might only have been a threat. It might not have been a real bomb,
So
So
you
somebody
never
was
really
just
knew.
being
You never really knew.
mischievous. Yeah, you never really knew. Now, did I ever feel really hard done by? Not particularly. Did I ever feel unsafe? I don't think I ever articulated that or felt, maybe my behavior did. I don't know. I've never thought that I felt unsafe. I know that I was far too accustomed to what I shouldn't have been accustomed to. So, for example, where our house was, there was a bridge down the road, which was a favorite place to plant a bomb in the hope of being able to trigger that bomb to blow up soldiers or police officers. So our front door was often being blown up the hall. And my mother used to run and make hot sweet tea, which is supposed to make you better after a big shock like that. And we both, my brother and I, got to the stage where we would say, just go back to bed, Mommy, we're okay. And we would
Oh,
just turn over
oh
and go
dear.
back to sleep. So we became too accustomed to what we shouldn't have become accustomed to. Now, in the middle of all of that, I was part of a small Protestant unionist community in a much larger, where I lived, nationalist Republican Catholic community. So I knew I was a minority in that community, even though, and it would be fair to say that the Protestant unionist community was the dominant community in Northern Ireland. So even though that was true, we were also the minority community where I lived. So my neighbours, my friends, many of them Catholic nationalists. And I suppose one of the life-changing moments for me in the midst of all of that, and with this in my mind, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you and all of that, life-changing moment. But the earliest one was when I was probably about 11 years old, when a woman and her husband were shot dead, and they had 5 children. The eldest child was injured, but all those children were left without parents. And they were from the Catholic nationalist community. They were moderate Catholics. They weren't at all connected to the Irish Republican Army or anything like that. They were moderates. And the people who shot them were not only from my community, but from my congregation.
So you knew who had shot them.
I didn't know at the time.
I
I
see.
knew that later. But I mean, obviously, as an 11-year-old child, you get a sense of people knowing something, even though you
Yes.
don't know what it is.
Yes.
So that was shattering to me, that someone that I knew, I knew the woman well. She worked in the library, in the local library, where I would have been in and out very regularly. I knew her very well. I knew her by name. I knew her to speak to. We'd been speaking to her and her husband the night before they were shot. They'd been out for a walk. It was one of those heat wave days like today, Elaine.
Mm.
It was I remember it was a lovely evening, and Daddy was working in the garden, and they'd walked past and they'd stopped to chat. And then, of course, we'd seen them and run out and joined in the conversation, and then they
And
were
so these
dead.
were your friends and your
Yeah.
family's friends, and then because they were Catholic, they were killed. And
And then we
so,
couldn't go to the funeral because Protestants didn't go into a Catholic church at that time. So we couldn't go to the funeral. We couldn't acknowledge what had happened. So that was the beginning of me questioning, what on earth is this all about?
yeah.
My good neighbors, my friends, what is this about? And then I suppose that you become more politically aware, that you have much option growing up in the middle of all of that. So by the time I was 18, we were having an election in which Bobby Sands, who was the first hunger striker, he was a Republican hunger striker. He eventually died on hunger strike, but he actually stood for election as a member of parliament in the constituency where I lived. And there it was again. What is this all about? Why are
Yeah.
people starving themselves to death for a political cause?
And so
Um,
were there places for the children, for like teenagers, young people to congregate? Were there people working on conflict resolution? Or is it was just divided camps? I mean, here you
this
were, this
is,
little girl who was obviously a brilliant
yeah,
little girl, trying to figure out why are people being killed who I know and care about, and why would anybody want to do that to anyone?
the I suppose the most shocking thing about it, as I reflect back on it, is that we didn't talk about it.
You didn't talk about it at all.
We didn't talk about it. So we didn't talk about the fact that the two of the people involved in the shooting came from our congregation. We didn't talk about the fact that people were dying on hunger strike. We talked about the impact of it, in the sense of, isn't this dreadful, and what's going to happen when somebody dies, etc., etc. Um, we talked in that sense, but we never talked about what it was doing to us as people.
Oh my goodness. And I'm
You
just
know.
thinking about the grief. And of
Hmm.
course, knowing that we both are very well schooled on the somatic, the biological impact
Yeah,
of when you don't have a way to talk about that kind of deep trauma.
yeah, yeah. And you're never going to heal if you heal either yourself or other people or a country, or make any kind of peace, if we aren't talking. And I suppose that's one of my big lessons, Elaine. Talking matters.
Yes, and even your role right now as the prisoner ombudsman, it's about talking and bringing out into the open things that sometimes are unspoken.
Yeah,
So we're ready to take, almost ready to take our break. And I just want our listeners to know that we are going to hear much more from this wise soul that will go to why there is the importance of talking, not only the work that she does with the prisoner ombudsman, but what she decided to do with her life, which I really would love to hear from you, talking about what made you decide to go into the ministry, and be in that part of the conflict, right in the middle of it, for 30 years. And not that saying that it hasn't all been washed away, because it hasn't, but I know that you're very much still active in trying to think about healing that can happen to that, the I guess the conspiracy of silence,
yeah,
to talk
absolutely.
about it that way. And often you hear about people saying it's better not to say anything at all than to say something. And when we come back, I want to share a little story too about a call that we had this morning with Ukraine,
Okay.
about a little girl who was living with a mom who was definitely grief stricken because of what's happening with that war. So to say that Lesley now, who's an adult woman, but there are 11-year-olds suffering in many parts of the world, that how can we make a difference now? I think that's one of the questions that I think we can maybe explore when we come back from our break. So we'll be back in just a few minutes after hearing from our sponsoring organization, the Trauma Resource Institute. um, and we'll be back shortly. Welcome back. I'm here with Lesley Carroll, the prisoner ombudsman of Northern Ireland, and we are talking about, well, we've been touching into the violence that happens in the world and her personal experience of living through a very tumultuous time in Northern Ireland. And we were just talking about her as an 11-year-old who sadly knew two people that were close to her that died because of the conflict, and just the imprint that leaves on a little person's heart and soul and mind. So Lesley, I'm just wondering, as we come back and to kind of explore that, as a result of that happening to you, how did that affect the course of what you became interested in? Because we were also talking about the silence of not talking about it. And here you became a minister, ministering to people. So over to you. If you can just give us a little bit more
Yeah,
insight.
I suppose one of the inquisitive questions, or coming from my inquisitive part, after that incident when I was 11, was, why would people do this to each other? What is it that makes someone want to shoot, bomb, kill, murder someone else? How does that happen? And perhaps there was an unhealthy fascination for me in the middle of all of that. But never, I mean, to be honest, there was a fascination. And there was also and I have no idea really why this sprung up so strongly, a great desire to be somebody who made peace or contributed to peace, a more peaceful world, so that people didn't have to live with the agony and the torture and the fear. And then there would have been a lot of fear around when I was growing up, while I wouldn't have necessarily been afraid myself in terms of my individual safety. Nevertheless, there was a fear that violence was going to break out on your doorstep, that uh, and we're very black humored in Northern Ireland, and we had to be to survive. So there would have been a running joke in our house. You could tune into the police band radio, and my dad would have been tuned into that all of the time. And if he'd have heard there was trouble nearby, he would have shouted, "Right, everybody into the car." So we'd have got in the car to go off to see where the trouble was. Because that was that crazy,
Well,
Um,
I'm saying is that even though there could have been fear, I mean, when your door is being blasted out of its moorings, I think that you had a kind of a way of coping to like minimize the impact of what was really happening. Because maybe if you had to face it, it would be too much.
it'd be too much. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it
It's
was
like our
kind of surreal, on reflection. So I want to be making peace. I want to understand why people are doing this to each other. I want to understand what it is about history and memory that makes people the way that they are. And I'm a person of faith, with these words echoing in my ears: "Blessed are the peacemakers, love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you." How the heck am I going to do anything to make a difference here? What is so I suppose there was a growing sense of vocation from all of that. And I decided that I would like to be a Presbyterian minister. I decided that was where my vocation lay. Now, it was a little bit of an oddity at the time. We had only just started to ordain women to the Presbyterian ministry by the time I was thinking of applying. So I was the 12th women ordained in our denomination. So it wasn't the most pleasant of journeys either. I apply for this, I get accepted. I'm thinking, this is great, this is God's call, this is God's work, and then it's hell on earth. Because not everybody thinks it's a really good idea for women to get ordained. So,
well, and I guess I would just say something about you about that too, is that the way that we had this conversation about Lesley being on the show, so I said, I'm going to do a show about women and courage. And you're one of the most courageous women I know. And of course, she would never say that. She'd go, Elaine, there's lots of people that are courageous, but being one of 12 of women entering the ministry at that time, Lesley, I'm just going to say, you can call it what it is, but I'm saying you've got a lot of courage.
Well, you see, I was so dumb, I didn't really realize.
Oh, so maybe you can accept it a little bit. That was a little bit of courage then.
Yeah. So I suppose I thought, and I mean, I admit I must have been incredibly naive, but you know what? I think that incredible naivety allowed me to survive for many years. So I'm not going to disown it completely, but
No.
I was naive enough to think that this was what I believed God was calling me to. The church had affirmed that calling, going through the interview process, the discernment process. Therefore, everything was going to be okay.
Well, as you say that too, is that you were naive, but there was a purpose that was bigger than self. And I think, I've been thinking about courage, thinking about the young woman in the United States named Cassidy Hutchinson, who just who worked for Meadows and who decided that she needed to speak to the January 6th committee. And I'm not saying whether any, in terms of what people believe about that, who are my listeners, but the fact that she decided to speak up, which was, in my estimation, when I heard her speak, there was something bigger that was involved in her speaking up, because I think in her case, but I think also in your case, just by speaking up, she put herself in great danger. And when you're deciding to become a Presbyterian minister at a time during the Troubles conflict in Northern Ireland, you're also placing yourself in great danger, because that there's a certain amount of population, they don't care who you are as a person, but it's what you represent that could make you a target, which I think is one of the very difficult parts of, dealing with, trying to think about peacemaking and bringing resolution to these kinds of, horrors that happen to humankind, because that's existing along with everything else. I don't know, your comment, your thought about that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think when we talk about being a peacemaker or wanting to be involved in making peace in the world, it sounds so grand. And to be honest, the beginning of learning what peacemaking and building was about had nothing to do with the conflict in Northern Ireland. Absolutely nothing. So I enter theological college. I've never really not got on with people in my whole life. Yes, there are people you like better than others, but the norm is we muddle along through life. We have the odd row in our family. We have the odd row argument, in school, all of that. But we're not really divided from each other as such. But I go to the seminary, to theological college, and there are people there who will not even look at me because I'm a woman. They won't come to prayers if I'm leading worship. They won't sit beside me in the dining room. If they go through the door before me, they'll not hold it for me coming behind because I simply don't exist. So suddenly, in this totally out of context for being this wonderful peacemaker, I'm faced with, what do I do with these people to whom I am the enemy?
So you actually walked into a system where you could have a very lived experience of what that was like.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I was the only woman in my year in the first year. In the second year, another woman came and joined, and in the third year, another woman came and joined. And that had another dimension to it, added another dimension to it as well. And for myself, I decided um, that no one should be treated badly. And that if I wanted to be treated well, then I needed to treat other people well. So I would have made the effort, and didn't always succeed, and didn't always find it easy, but I did try to always make the effort to speak to the people who wouldn't speak to me.
So as life has gone through the years, I'm just curious, have some of those people that you would have been in ministry with, did they end up changing their tune? Because so much happened in the last 30 years regarding women in the ministry, or not?
Some did and some didn't, and some realized that they hadn't treated us women well. They didn't change their theological opinion, which is absolutely fine. But they did realize they hadn't treated us well, and they might have said something about that. In other instances, people almost changed their minds completely. And sometimes I'm making a judgment about that because not everyone will come back and explain that to you or talk to you, but sometimes they will. So there would have been a mixture there. But I think as we all went out into the world and matured, we realized that this business of treating each other so badly and pretending that we didn't exist and making each other invisible was not the way for anybody to behave, never mind the Christian community to
I
behave.
know, it just seems so, to me, ironic to think about Christianity and being a minister is about, tending to the flock of Christ. And that
Yeah,
part of that would be treat, the golden rule, treat others as you would want to be treated yourself. And to think that there were
absolutely.
those that went the opposite way when they're going to be ministers is always just such a confusion for me. And I
And
imagine the kind of person you were, it was probably confusing to you too.
I mean, it was extremely confusing because it certainly wasn't what I expected. But we're kind of back at the same theme as before the break. So talking matters, bringing things to the surface rather than pushing them down matters. Being real about what's happening in front of your eyes matters, and it matters because violence breeds violence. And if we don't do anything at all, if we simply stand by and allow violence to continue, then it will breed more violence. So we need to be bringing to the surface always the impact of that, encouraging people to speak to each other about the impact of that, encouraging people to speak up, speaking up ourselves, always bringing that to the surface. And I go back to the movie I saw last week about Srebrenica, and to a woman called Aida who was working for the UN as a translator. She had taught, she was a teacher in Srebrenica, actually. So she had taught many of those who were murdered, and she had taught many of those who carried out the murders. But she had to speak because she was an interpreter. And straight after the movie, we had a panel discussion, and my immediate reaction was, you expect me to speak after seeing this movie? I have no words. But actually, I must have words. We must speak. And I think that lesson is really important. I could have, as I look back at theological college, I could have just accepted the situation rather than try to do something about it. Doing something about it wasn't that dramatic at all. It might have just been saying good morning to someone who pretended I wasn't there. But that was refusing to be a bystander in a very simple way.
Well, and I also think that the other part about violence is there's a physical violence, but there's also emotional violence, psychological violence. And, when we talk about shunning, which sounds like they tried to shun you, and also bullying, because there's also can be a component of bullying and shunning, that can be as horrible for the body as physical violence. In terms of those same places in the brain are reactive as if we were being physically hurt. So it's important for people to know that violence comes in many forms, and it's not only with physical violence. It also can be with the words that you use or not use. Even welcoming you would have been something that would have been more helpful than just pretending like you didn't exist. Because when we think that someone, and this is what always concerns me, and I remember going to the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles, and they had some, they talked about the Rwandan genocide, and they talked about how the Tutsis the Hutus would talk about the Tutsis as being cockroaches. You see, you could kill a cockroach, but you can't kill a human being. And it's the way that we dehumanize the other in so many different ways, like dehumanizing you as, not becoming invisible, is how violence can be nurtured. And so I just wanted to emphasize that, because speaking up and truth to power, which was why I appreciated that young woman. I might feel very differently from her politically, but I do respect her courage of saying there was something that was happening that was about harming people that was wrong to me, and I couldn't keep silent. And
absolutely.
And that's also sounds, even the way that you started in small ways, but I know that you did more than say hello to people, Lesley. So can you say a little bit more about, the kinds of things that you have been involved with that have been helpful?
So, I suppose, again, to stick with the naivety theme, so, to remember that I'm committed to loving my enemies and praying for those who persecute me, to know that I'm learning to at least greet people who don't want to greet me, to know that there are people who look upon me as an enemy, as well as me looking on others as an enemy. All of this is going on. And then I receive an invitation to enter into dialogue with Sinn Féin, which is the political party at the time representing the IRA in the public domain, the Irish Republican Army.
And they were the most radicalized at that time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So they would have been responsible for the Republican violence. There would have been other terrorist organizations as well. But the IRA were the ones who wanted Ireland to be united. So the unionist community felt, and my community felt, that we were being attacked on all sides by republicanism. So I receive a call from a priest to say, we have these regular dialogues with senior people in the Irish Republican Army. We'd like you to come and be part of those conversations. And I'm like, what?
And they invited you.
Yeah, what have I got to say? you know, why are you asking me? Will this put me or my family in danger? Will this put my ministry in danger? All these questions come torrenting through my mind. And in the end of the day, there is only one answer, because I've been going around saying, you know, we should love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. And we should be talking to each other and not dehumanizing each other by pretending we don't exist. I didn't really have any choice
Well,
at all.
I'm going to say that you could have had a choice, but you chose not to, because there was that, I mean, and please correct me, you know, you can, that overarching belief that you had about purpose and meaning was more important than your individual safety at that point.
Well, it absolutely was. It absolutely was. And I think maybe important for context, because this would have been probably around the early 1990s. At that time, people from the Republican movement weren't allowed to speak publicly at all. So if someone from the Republican movement was appearing on the news, there would have been a voiceover. We would never have actually heard their voice. And people didn't shake hands. So, you know, if people from the opposite side met in public, they didn't shake hands, they didn't greet each other. So that was the kind of context that we were living in, as well as the violence still being very active.
Oh my gosh,
And people,
you were the perfect person. And when you tell me about what happened with your ministry, about you not being even acknowledged and being invisible, is that's what was happening to the Republicans. They were invisible, even if you could see their face. Their
yes,
words were not being heard. So
that's
you
right.
understood that from a very visceral level.
That's absolutely I did. So we've started to meet, and we met every month, a group of us ministers from different traditions, Catholic and Protestant, with some senior Republicans. And I mean, I don't know what people imagine goes on in a conversation like that. I know that some people would talk about me as a do-gooder, but they certainly weren't do-goodish conversations. They were sometimes very difficult conversations. You know, why did the IRA set that bomb last week? Why did the IRA think it was okay to blow those people up last week? Why did the IRA think it was okay to target that police officer and murder him last week? Do you realize what kind of situation you've left your family in? So
And
they
so were
weren't
there responses in
gentle.
terms?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the Republican movement at that time was engaged in a project to get to know their unionist neighbours. So they had reached a point, understanding that their war had been with the British, and they thought very much in terms of London. But actually, their people in the next door street who were unionist also thought of themselves as British. So in the Republican mind, they weren't waging war on their neighbour in the next street.
Uh,
But in the unionist mind, they were the person in the street next door, and they did feel like war was being waged
so
on
you
them.
had to unwrap
So
those beliefs.
those were the kinds of things that we were having conversations about. And yes, they were raw conversations, and sometimes very difficult conversations.
Well, Lesley, as we're talking about this and I'm seeing our time quickly slipping away, I want to have you come back to kind of further this conversation. I hope you're willing to do that with me, because I think that we're just getting started on even starting the conversation. So, I mean, so basically there was grief, there was silence, and that there was a group of people from both sides that said, we need to talk. And you talked about very difficult things, but that talking about very difficult things was the beginning of
Yeah,
not being completely in separate camps, even though there were different ideologies.
yeah,
There was at least the conversation.
yeah.
And so, is there anything about the talks, like you could say maybe in a minute or so, about what you want our listeners to leave with right now about those talks and how that pertains to today?
Um, the open lines of communication are absolutely critical. So I know that in the US you have a big problem with gun violence.
We do.
You need to be talking to the people who are on the opposite side. You need to be getting people into the same room who have different opinions. You need police officers, you need community people,
You need the NRA, the
you need
National Rifle
you
Association.
need the NRA, you need the
Yeah,
public policy makers, you need them all in the same room, because until everybody's talking to everybody, and you also need in that room people who have suffered, who will tell their story, because it's the only authentic thing that'll be in that room in the end of the
right.
day.
Well,
Um,
and today President Biden talked about the new legislation, and I know that there was a father that said, this is not enough in terms of, what would have protected my son's life, who died in one of the mass shootings at one of the high schools. So I think what you're saying is really important for us all to listen to. And I want to say, Lesley, how much I admire you. Lesley's a very humble person. She hates it when I do this. When I say to her how much I admire her, look at that. If you could see her, she's shaking her head. Elaine, stop. But I do. And I think I do because of the very nature of who you are, that there is a humility about what it is that you know and how you show up in the world in such a way that is a peacemaker. And you not necessarily are in the center limelight all the time when you're working. In fact, she's shaking her head. If you could see
no,
her.
definitely not.
Yes.
We didn't tell anybody. I never told anybody I was meeting those people in the only people who knew were the people in the room.
And so you were doing all that in trying behind the scenes to create a better Northern Ireland for people to not have to die. I'm sure thinking about the memory of those lovely people that died in your community. Can you just say their first names so maybe we can end today in their memory?
Um, Gertie and Jim.
Okay, Gertie and Jim, and to their memory and to the memory that was spawned, that and for the little girl that day was spawned into action, that spawned her into action, that she said, I was going to do something differently to maybe bring an end to this kind of violence. And to you, my friend, you are the living example of what else is true in the world. And my listeners have heard me say these words many times, but those of you that are in situations where you can make a difference, as you heard from Lesley, it might just be saying hello to someone who is marginalizing or minimizing you. It may be sitting in rooms that are uncomfortable and talking about differences. But regardless of the different way that you come forth, remember what else can be true. And we're having Lesley on again so she can say a second part of the story, because there's a lot more to tell. Thank you, my dear friend.
Thank
Appreciate you
you.
coming on. And it's very late in Northern Ireland right now. It's like almost 9 o'clock in the evening. So thank you.
Thank
Till
you.
we meet again.
All the best.